Hello! In this video, you'll learn about some special methods that you can define in your classes. These methods are known as built-in methods. You've actually already seen a built-in method, the init method. This method is a built-in method because it is actually automatically defined on every class. Yep, technically that means you don't have to define it. But if you don't, you have to accept the default version, which basically does nothing. I should point out that you're not allowed to have nothing in your class definition. Or if you want to have nothing, you have to have the word pass, otherwise Python will yell at you. Anyway, if you do choose to define your own version of a built-in method, your version overrides or replaces the default version. There are a bunch of other methods you can do this with, and I'm going to show you a couple examples in this lesson. For starters, there's a default method that allows you to print out an instance of your class. As you can see, the default version of this method isn't very useful. It would be nice to just say print p1 and have it print the values for x and y. The name of this built-in method is __repr___. Repr is short for representation. By overriding it, you can customize how instances of your class are represented in the console when they get printed. It should always return a string. The string is what will appear in your console when you print an instance of your class. Let's get rid of the repr method for a second so that we can focus on another built-in method. Let's say you have 2 points with the same coordinates. Note that these points are not identical in the strict sense. They are still separate points. They just happen to correspond to the same location in 2D space. It would be nice to be able to use the double equals operator to test whether these points are equivalent, whether they effectively have the same contents, regardless of identity. There's actually a built-in method that gets called whenever you use double equals to compare 2 instances of your class. As you can see, the default version of this isn't satisfactory. 2 points with the same x and y values should be considered equal, but as of now, they are not. Even though p1 and p2 have the same contents, they have the same x and y coordinates, the double equals sign will still return false. We can fix this by overriding this method, __eq__. eq is short for equals, and as mentioned, it gets called whenever we compare 2 instances of our class to each other using double equals. When you override this method, you need to accept 2 arguments. The first one is self, and it corresponds to the point instance on the left side of the double equals sign. I've named the second one other, and it corresponds to the point instance on the right side of the double equals sign. You should make sure that the return value of this method is a Boolean. This Boolean should correspond to whether or not 2 instances should be considered equivalent. Let's look at another example in the editor. Let's say we work in a sheet music store and we're responsible for organizing a bunch of sheet music, and we need to be able to determine if 2 pieces of sheet music are the same based on the opus and the number. So I'm going to make a class called piece of music, and it's going to have 2 instance variables, opus and number, and both are going to be integers. And I'm going to set those in the init method. I'm going to say self.opus equals, and I'm actually going to set these based on parameters, opus and number, self.opus equals opus, self.number equals number. All right, so check this out. We can say p1 equals piece of music, opus 34 number 2, and p2 is piece of music, opus 1 number 2, p3 equals piece of music, opus 34 number 2. So p1 and p3 should be considered equivalent. Now let's demonstrate the repr method first by trying to print these. And right now when I print them, the output isn't that meaningful. It just says piece of music object for each one. So let's make the output a little bit more meaningful by overriding the repr method. Let's take self, and I want each piece of music to be represented by a string that is opus plus the opus number. Oops, I have to say self.opus. Let's actually see what happens when I just do opus. So we get an error, and it's because opus is not defined. So opus exists only on the self object. So whenever we're accessing an instance variable from within a method, we still have to say self.name of the instance variable. And let's make this a little more complete. Let's say opus number, and then number. Let's try this. There we go. That looks better. Opus 34 number 2, opus 1 number 2, opus 34 number 2. Great. Now let's test out whether or not Python thinks these are equal. P1 equals p2. equals P3. So the first of these should be false. These are not equal. This should be true because this and this are equal. But if we run it, they're both going to be considered to be false. So what we need to do is override the EQ method. Remember, it takes two arguments, self and other. And I'm going to say they're equal if self.opus is equal to other.opus and self.number is equal to other.number. Remember, P1 is going to be self in this case, and P2 is going to be other. Or on this line, P1 is going to be self and P3 is going to be other. So let's test this out. And now the second one is true because P1.opus is equal to P3.opus and P1.number is equal to P3.number.